letter to her mother the very next day, and by the end of the week, a response to her communication arrived in Joan Durbifield's wandering last-century hand. Dear Tess, Jay, write these few lines, hoping they will find you well, as they leave me at present. Thank God for it. Dear Tess, we are all glad to hear that you are going really to be married soon. But with respect to your question, Tess, Jay say between ourselves, quite private, but very strong, that on no account do you say a word of your bygone trouble to him. Jay did not tell everything to your father, he being so proud on account of his respectability, which, perhaps, your intended is the same. Many women, some of the highest in the land, have had a trouble in their time, and why would you trumpet yours when others don't trumpet theirs? No girl would be such a fool, especially as it is so long ago, and not your fault at all. Jay shall answer the same if you ask me 50 times. Besides, you must bear in mind that, knowing it to be your childish nature to tell all that's in your heart, so simple, Jay made you promise me never to let it out by word or deed, having your welfare in my mind, and you solemnly did promise going from this door. Jay have father as he would blab it everywhere, poor simple man. Dear Tess, keep up your spirits, and we mean to send you a hogshead of cider for your wedding, knowing there is not much in your parts, and thin sour stuff, what there is. So, no murdered present, and with kind love to your young man, from your affect, Mother, J. Durberfield. Oh, mother, mother, murmured Tess. She was recognizing how light was the touch of events that, the most oppressive, wrought upon Mrs. Durbifield's elastic spirit. Her mother did not see life as Tess saw it. That haunting episode of bygone days was, to her mother, but a passing accident. But perhaps her mother was right as to the course to be followed, whatever she might be in her reasons. Silence seemed, on the face of it, best for her adored one's happiness. Silence it should be. Thus steadied by a command from the only person in the world who had any shadow of right to control her action, Tess grew calmer. The responsibility was shifted, and her heart was lighter than it had been for weeks. The days of declining autumn, which followed her ascent, beginning with the month of October, formed a season through which she lived in spiritual altitudes, more nearly approaching ecstasy than any other period of her life. There was hardly a touch of earth in her love for Claire. To her sublime trustfulness, he was all that goodness could be, knew all that a guide, philosopher, and friend should know. She thought every line in the contour of his person the perfection of masculine beauty. His soul, the soul of a saint, his intellect, that of a seer. The wisdom of her love for him, as love, sustained her dignity. She seemed to be wearing a crown. The compassion of his love for her, by comparison, made her lift up her heart to him in devotion. He would sometimes catch her large, worshipful eyes that had no bottom to them, looking at him from their depths, as if she saw something immortal before her. She dismissed the past, trod upon it, and put it out, as one treads on a coal that is smouldering and dangerous. She had not known that men could be so disinterested, chivalrous, protective, in their love for women as he. Angel Claire was far from all that she thought. spiritual than animal. He had himself well in hand, and was singularly free from grossness. Though not good-natured, he was rather bright than hot, less Byronic than Shelleyan, could love desperately, but his love more especially inclined to the imaginative and ethereal. It was an emotion which could jealously guard the loved one against his very self. This amazed and enraptured Tess, whose light experiences had been so inflectuous till now, and in her reaction from indignation against the male sex she swerved to excess of honour for Claire. They unaffectedly sought each other's company in her most honest faith. She did not disguise her desire to be with him. The sum of her instincts on this matter, if clearly stated, would have been that the elusive quality in her sex, which attracted men in general, might be distasteful to so perfect a man after her avowal of love, since it must in its very nature carry with it a suspicion of art. The country custom of unreserved comradeship out of doors during betrothal was the only custom she knew, and to her it had no strangeness, though it seemed oddly anticipative to Claire till he saw how normal a thing she, in common with all the other dairy folk, regarded it. Thus, during this October month of wonderful afternoons, they roved along the meads by creeping paths which followed the brinks of trickling tributary brooks, hopping across by little wooden bridges to the other side and back again. They were never out of the sound of some purling ware, whose buzz accompanied their own murmuring, while the beams of the sun, almost as horizontal as the mead itself, formed a pollen of radiance over the landscape. They saw tiny blue fogs in the shadows of trees and hedges, all the time that there was bright sunshine everywhere elsewhere. The sun was so near the ground, and the sward so flat, that the shadows of Claire and Tess would stretch a quarter of a mile ahead of them, like two long fingers pointing afar to where the green alluvial reaches abutted against the sloping sides of the vale. Men were at work here and there, for it was the season for taking up the meadows, or taking the little waterways clear for the winter irrigation, and mending their banks where trodden down by the cows. The shovelfuls of loam, black as jet, brought there by the river, when it was as wide as the whole valley, were an essence of soils, pounded champagnes of the past, steeped, refined, and subtilized to extraordinary riches, out of which came all the fertility of the mead and of the cattle grazing there. Claire hardly kept his arm round her waist in sight of these watermen, with an air of a man who was accustomed to public dalliance, though actually as shy as she who, with lips parted and eyes askance on labourers, wore the look of a wary animal in the wild. "You are not ashamed of owning me as yours before them," she said gladly. "Oh, no. But if it should reach the ears of your friends at a minister that you are walking about like this with me, a milkmaid, the most bewitching ever seen, they might feel it a hurt to their dignity. My dear girl, a d'Urberville hurt the dignity of a Clare. It is a grand card to play, that of your belonging to such a family, and I am surged up to her eyes. She put her hand in his, and thus they went on, to a place where the reflected sun glared up from the river, under a bridge with a molten metallic glow that dazzled their eyes, though the sun itself was hidden by the bridge. They stood still, whereupon little furred and feathered heads popped up from the smooth surface of the water, but, finding that the disturbing presences had paused and not passed by, they disappeared again. Upon this river brink they lingered till the fog began to close around them, which was very early in the evening at this time of the year, settling on the lashes of her eyes, where it rested like crystals, and on his brows and hair. They walked later on Sundays, when it was quite dark. Some of the dairy people, who were also out of doors on the first Sunday evening after their engagement, heard her impulsive speeches, ecstatized to fragments, though they were too far off to hear the words discoursed, noted the spasmodic catch in her remarks, broken into syllables by the leaping of her heart as she walked, leaning on his arm, her contented pauses, the occasional little laugh, upon which her soul seemed to ride, the laugh of a woman in company with the man she loves, and has won from all other women, unlike anything else in nature. They saw the buoyancy of her tread, like the skim of a bird which is not quite alighted. Her affection for him was now the breath and life of Tess's being. It enveloped her as a photosphere. It radiated her from the forgetfulness of her past sorrows, keeping back the gloomy spectres that would persist in their attempts to touch her. Doubt, fear, moodiness, care, shame. She knew that they were waiting like wolves just outside the circumscribing light, but she had long spells of power to keep them in hungry subjection there. A spiritual forgetfulness coexisted with an intellectual remembrance. She walked in brightness, but she knew that, in the background, those shapes of darkness were always spread. They might be receding, or they might be approaching, one or the other, a little every day. One evening, Tess and Claire were obliged to sit indoors, keeping house, all the other occupants of the domicile being away. As they talked, she looked thoughtfully up at him, and met his too appreciative eyes. "I am not worthy of you. No, I am not," she burst out, jumping up from her low stool, as though appalled at his homage, and the fullness of her own joy thereat. Claire, deeming the whole basis of her excitement to be that which was only the smaller part of it, said, "I won't have you speak like it, dear Tess. Distinction does not consist in the facial use of a contemptible set of conventions, but in being numbered among those who are true and honest and just and pure and lovely and of a good report, as you are, my Tess." She struggled with the sob in her throat, which often, at that string of excellencies, made her young heart ache in church of late years, and how strange that he should have cited them now. "Why didn't you stay and love me when I was 16, living with my little sisters and brothers, and you danced on the green? Oh, why didn't you? Why didn't you?" she said, impetuously clasping her hands. Angel began to comfort and reassure her, thinking to himself, truly enough, what a creature of moods she was, and how careful he would have to be of her when she depended for her happiness entirely on him. "Why didn't I come?" he said. "That is just what I feel. If I had only known. But you must not be so bitter in your regret. Why should you be?" With the woman's instinct to hide, she diverged hastily. "I should have had 3 more years of your heart than I can ever have now. Then I should have not wasted my time as I have done. I should have had so much longer happiness. It was no mature woman with a long, dark vista of intrigue behind her who was tormented thus, but a girl of simple life, not yet 21, who had been caught during her days of immaturity like a bird in a springe. To calm herself the more completely, she rose from her little stool and left the room, overturning her stool with her skirts as she went. He sat on by the cheerful firelight, thrown from a bundle of green ash sticks laid across the dogs. The sticks snapped pleasantly and hissed out bubbles of sap from their ends. When she came back, she was herself again. Do you not think you are just a wee bit capricious, fitful Tess? He said, good-humouredly, as he spread a cushion for her on the stool and seated himself in the settle beside her. I wanted to ask you something, and just then you ran away. Yes, perhaps I am capricious, she murmured. She suddenly approached him and put a hand upon each of his arms. No, Angel, I be not really so. By nature, I mean. The more practically to assure him that she was not, she placed herself close to him in the settle and allowed her head to find a resting place against Claire's shoulder. What did you want to ask me? I am sure I will answer it, she continued humbly. Well, you love me and have agreed to marry me, and hence there follows a thirdly. When shall the day be? I like living like this, but I must think of starting in business on my own hook with the new year, or a little later, and before I get involved in the multifarious details of my new position, I should like to have secured my partner. But, she timidly answered, to speak quite practically, wouldn't it be best not to marry till after all that? Though I can't bear the thought of your going away and leaving me here. Of course you cannot, and it is not best in this case. I want you to help me in many ways in making my start. When shall it be? Why not a fortnight from now? No, she said, becoming grave. I have so many things to think of first. But he drew her gently nearer to him. The reality of marriage was startling when it loomed so near. Before discussion of the question had proceeded further, there walked round the corner of the settle into the full firelight of the apartment Mr. Dairyman Crick, Mrs. Crick, and 2 of the milkmaids. Tess sprang like an elastic ball from his side to her feet, while her face flushed and her eyes shone in the firelight. I knew how it would be if I sat so close to him, she cried, with vexation. I said to myself, they are sure to come and catch us. But I wasn't really sitting on his knee, though it might have seemed as if I was almost. Well, if so be you hadn't told us, I'm sure we hadn't noticed that you had been sitting anywhere at all in this light, replied the dairyman. He continued to his wife with the solid mind of a man who understood nothing of the emotions relating to matrimony. Now, Christiana, that shows that folks should never fancy other folks be supposing things when they paint. Oh no, I should never have thought a word of where she was sitting if she hadn't told me. Not I. We are going to be married soon, said Claire, with improvised phlegm. Ah, and be ye? Well, I'm truly glad to hear it, sir. I've thought you might do such a thing for some time. She's too good for a dairymaid. I said so the very first day I saw her, and a prize for any man. And what's more, a wonderful woman for a gentleman farmer's wife. He won't be at the mercy of his bailey. We are at his side. Somehow Tess disappeared. She had been even more touched by Crick's blunt praise. After supper, when she reached her bedroom, they were all present. A light was burning, and each girl was sitting by whitely in her bed, awaiting Tess, like a row of avenging ghosts. But she saw in a few moments that there was no malice in their mood. They could scarcely feel as a loss what they had never expected to have. Their condition was objective, contemplative. "He's going to marry her," murmured Reddy, never taking eyes off Tess. "How her face shows it." "You be going to marry him?" asked Marianne. "Yes," said Tess. "When?" "Someday." They thought this was evasiveness only. "Yes, going to marry him, a gentleman," repeated Hewitt. And by a sort of fascination, the three girls, one after another, crept out of their beds and came and stood barefooted round Tess. Reddy put her hands upon Tess's shoulders, as if to realize her friend's corporeality after such a miracle, and the other two laid their arms round her waist, all looking into her face. "How it do seem, almost more than I can think of," said Hewitt. Marianne kissed Tess. "Yes," she murmured, as she withdrew her lips. Was that because of love for her, or because of other lips have touched there by now? Continued Is dryly to Marianne. "I wasn't thinking of that," said Marianne simply. "I was only feeling all the strangeness of it, that she is to be his wife and nobody else. I don't say nay to it, nor either of us, because we did not think of it, only loved him. Still, nobody else is to marry him in the world. No fine lady, nobody in jewels and gold, in silks and satins, but she who do live like we." "Are you sure you don't dislike me for it?" said Tess in a low voice. They hung about her in their scant white nightgowns before replying, as they considered their answer might lie in her look. I don't know, murmured Reddy Brittle. "I want to hate E, but I cannot." "That's how I feel," echoed Is and Marianne. "I can't hate her. Somehow she hinders me." "He ought to marry one of you," murmured Tess. "Why?" "You're all better than I. We better than you," said the girls in a low, slow whisper. No, dear Tess." "You are," she contradicted impetuously, and suddenly, tearing away from their clinging arms, she burst into a hysterical fit of tears, bowing herself on the chest of drawers, and repeating incessantly, "Oh, yes, yes, yes." Having once given way, she could not stop her weeping. "He ought to have had one of you," she cried. "I think I ought to make him even now. You would be better for him than... I don't know what I'm saying. Oh, oh." They went up to her and clasped her round, but still her sobs tore her. "Get some water," said Marianne. "She's upset by us. Poor thing, poor thing." They gently led her back to the side of her bed, where they kissed her warmly. "You are best friend," said Marianne, more ladylike, "and a better scholar than we, especially since he has taught E so much. But even you ought to be proud. You be proud, I'm sure." "Yes, I am," she said, "and I am ashamed at so breaking down." When they were all in bed and the light was out, Marianne whispered across to her, "You will think of us when you be his wife, Tess, and of how we told E that we loved him, and how we tried not to hate you, and did not hate you, and could not hate you, because you were his choice, and we never hoped to be chose by him." They were not aware that at these words salt, stinging tears trickled down upon Tess's pillow anew, and resolved, with a bursting heart, to tell all her history to Angel Clare, despite her mother's command, to let him for whom she lived and breathed despise her if he would, and her mother regard her as a fool, rather than persevere a silence which must be deemed a treachery to him, and which somehow seemed a wrong to these. Chapter 32. This penitential mood kept her from naming the wedding day. The beginning of November found its date still in abeyance, though he asked her at the most tempting times. But Tess's desire seemed to be for perpetual betrothal, in which everything should remain as it was then. The meads were changing now, but it was still warm enough in early afternoons, before milking, to idle there a while, and the state of dairy work at this time of year allowed a spare hour for idling. Looking over the damp sod in the direction of the sun, a glistening ripple of gossamer webs was visible to their eyes under the luminary, like the track of moonlight on the sea. Gnats, knowing nothing of their brief glorification, wandered across the air in this pathway, irritated as if they bore fire within them, then passed out of its line and were quite extinct. In the presence of these things, he would remind her that the date was still the question, or he would ask her at night, when he accompanied her on some mission invented by Mrs. Crook to give them the opportunity. This was mostly a journey to the farmhouse on the slopes above the vale, to inquire how the advanced cows were getting on in the straw garden to which they were relegated. For it was a time of the year that brought great changes to the world of kine. Batches of the animals were sent away daily to this lying-in hospital, where they lived on straw till their calves were born, after which event, and as soon as the calf could walk, mother and offspring were driven back to the dairy. In the interval which elapsed before the calves were sold, there was, of course, little milking to be done, but as soon as the calves had been taken away, the milkmaids would have set to work as usual. Returning from one of these dark walks, they reached a great gravel cliff immediately over the levels, where they stood still and listened. The water was now high in the streams, squirting through their wares and tinkling under culverts. The smallest gullies were all full. There was no taking shortcuts anywhere, and foot passengers were compelled to follow the permanent ways. From the whole extent of the invisible veil came a multitudinous inundation. It forced upon their fancy that a great city lay below them, and that the murmur was the vociferation of its populace. It seems like tens of thousands of them, said Tess, holding public meetings in their marketplaces, arguing, preaching, quarrelling, sobbing, groaning, praying, and cursing. Claire was not particularly heeding. Did Greg speak to you today, dear, about his not wanting much assistance during the winter months? No. The cows are going dry rapidly. Yes, she answered. 6 or 7 went to the straw garden yesterday, and 3 the day before, making nearly 20 in the straw already. Is it that the farmer don't want my help for the calving? Oh, I am not wanted here any more, and I have tried so hard too. Craig didn't exactly say that he would no longer require you, but knowing what our relations were, he said, in the most good-natured and respectful manner possible, that he supposed on my leaving at Christmas I should take you with me saw that before you did. She was seeing it then. To decline to marry him, after all, in obedience to her emotion of last night, and leave the dairy, meant to go to some strange place, not a dairy, for milkmaids were not in request now, calving time was coming on. To go to some arable farm, where no divine being like Angel Clare was. She hated the thought, and she hated more the thought of going home. So that, seriously, dear Tess, he continued, since you will probably have to leave at Christmas, it is in every way desirable and convenient that I should carry you off then as my property. Besides, if you were not the most uncalculating girl in the world, you would know that we cannot go on like this forever. I wish we could, that it would always be summer and autumn, and you always courting me, and always thinking as much of me as you have done through the past summer time. I always shall. Oh, I know you will, she cried, with a sudden fervour of faith in him. Angel, I will fix the day when I become yours for always. Thus, at last it was arranged between them, during that dark walk home, amid the myriads of liquid voices on the right and left. When they reached the dairy, Mr. and Mrs. Crick were promptly told, with injunctions to secrecy, for each of the lovers was desirous that the marriage should be kept as private as possible. The dairyman, though he had thought of dismissing her soon, now had a great concern about losing her. What should he do about his skimming? Who would make the ornamental butter pats with Anglebury and Sanborn ladies? Mrs. Crick congratulated Tess on the shilly-shallying having at last come to an end, and said that directly she set eyes on Tess, she divined that she was not to be the chosen one of somebody who was no common outdoor man. Tess had looked so superior as she walked across the garden on that afternoon of her arrival that she was of a good family, she could have sworn. In point of fact, Mrs. Crick did remember thinking that Tess was graceful and good-looking as she approached, but the superiority might have been a growth of the imagination aided by subsequent knowledge. Tess was now carried along upon the wings of the hours, without a sense of will. The word had been given, the number of the day written down. Her naturally bright intelligence had begun to admit the fatalistic convictions common to field folk, and those who associate more extensively with natural phenomena than with their fellow creatures, and she, accordingly, drifted into that passive responsiveness to all things her lover suggested, characteristic of the frame of mind. But she wrote anew to her mother, ostensibly to notify the wedding day, really to again implore her advice. It was a gentleman who had chosen her, which perhaps her mother had not sufficiently considered. A post-nuptial explanation, which might be accepted with a light heart by a rougher man, might not be received with the same feeling by him. But this communication brought no reply from Mrs. Durbeyfield. Despite Angel Clare's plausible representations to himself and to Tess of the practical need for their immediate marriage, there was in truth an element of precipitancy in the step, as became apparent at a later date. He loved her dearly, though perhaps rather ideally than with the impassioned thoroughness of her feelings for him. He had entertained no notion, when doomed as he had thought to an unintellectual, bucolic life, that such charms as he beheld in this idyllic creature would be found behind the scenes. Unsophistication was a thing to talk of, but he had not known how it really struck one until he came here. But he was very far from seeing his future track clearly, and it might be a year or two before he would be able to consider himself fairly started in life. The secret lay in the tinge of recklessness imparted to his career and character She had caught his manner and habits, his speeches and phrases, his likings and his aversions, and to leave her in farmland would be to let her slip back again out of accord with him. He wished to have her under his charge for another reason. His parents had naturally desired to see her once at least before he carried her off to a distant settlement, English or colonial, and as no opinion of theirs was to be allowed to change his intention, he judged that a couple of months' life with him in lodgings, while seeking for an advantageous opening, would be of some social assistance to her at what she might feel to be a trying ordeal, her presentation to his mother at the vicarage. Next, he wished to see a little of the working of a flour mill, having an idea that he might combine the use of one with corn growing. Proprietor of a large old water mill at Wellbridge, once the mill of an abbey, had offered him the inspection of his time-honoured mode of produce, and a hand in the operations for a few days, whenever he should choose to come. Claire paid a visit to the place, some few miles distant, one day at this time, to inquire particulars, and returned to Talbothy's in the evening. She found him determined to spend a short time at the Wellbridge flour mills, and what had determined him, less the opportunity of an insight into grinding and bolting than the casual fact that lodgings were to be obtained in that very farmhouse which, before its mutilation, had been the mansion of a branch of the d'Urberville family. This was how Claire decided practical questions, by a sentiment which had nothing to do with them. They decided to go immediately after the wedding and remain for a fortnight, instead of journeying to towns and inns. Then we will start off to examine some farms on the other side of London that I have heard of, he said, and by March or April we will pay a visit to my father and mother. Questions of procedure such as these arose and passed, and the incredible day on which she was to become his, loomed large in the near future. The 31st of December, New Year's Eve, was the date. His wife, she said to herself. Could it ever be? Their two selves together, nothing to divide them, every instant shared by them. Why not? And yet, why? One Sunday morning, Ace Hewitt returned from church and spoke privately to Tess. He was not called home this morning. What? It should have been the first time of asking today, she answered, looking quietly at Tess. You meant to be married New Year's Eve, dearie. The other returned a quick affirmative. And there must be 3 times of asking. Now there will be only 2 Sundays left between. Tess felt her cheek paling. Is was right. Of course there must be 3. Perhaps he had forgotten. If so, there must be a week's postponement, and that was unlucky. How could she remind her lover? She who had been so backward, and suddenly fired with impatience and alarm lest she should lose her dear prize. A natural incident relieved her anxiety. Is mentioned the omission of the banns to Mrs. Craig, and Mrs. Craig assumed a matron's privilege of speaking to Angel on the point. Have ye forgotten Mr. Clare? The banns, I mean. No, I have not forgotten, said Claire. As soon as he got Tess alone, he assured her. Don't let them tease you about the banns. A license will be quieter for us, and I have decided on a license. So, if you go to church on Sunday morning, you will not hear your own name if you wish to. I didn't wish to go and hear it, dearest, she said proudly. But to know that things were in train was an immense relief to Tess, notwithstanding, who had well nigh feared that somebody would stand up and forbid the banns on the ground of her history. How events were favouring her. I don't quite feel easy, she said to herself. All this fortune may be scourged out of me afterwards by a lot of ill. That's how heaven mostly does. I wish I could have had common bands. But everything went smoothly. She wondered if he would like her to be married in her present best white frock, or if she ought to buy a new one. The question was set at rest by his forethought, disclosed by the arrival of some large packages addressed to her. Inside them she found a whole stock of clothing, from bonnet to shoes, including a perfect morning costume, such as would well suit the simple wedding they planned. He entered the house shortly after the arrival of the packages, and heard her upstairs undoing them. A minute later she came down, with a flush on her face and tears in her eyes. "How thoughtful you've been," she murmured, her cheek upon his shoulder. "Even to the gloves and handkerchief. My own love. How good, how kind." No, Tess. Just an order to a tradeswoman in London. Nothing more." And to divert her from thinking too highly of him, he told her to go upstairs and take her time and see if it all fitted, and if not, to get the village seamstress to make a few alterations. She did turn upstairs and put on the gown. Alone, she stood for a moment before the glass, looking at the effect of her silk attire, and then there came into her head her mother's ballad of the mystic robe, that never would become that wife that had once done amiss, which Mrs. Durbeyfield had used to sing to her as a child, so blithely and so artfully, her foot on the cradle, which she rocked to the tune. Suppose this robe should betray her by changing colour, as her robe had betrayed Queen Genevieve since she had been at the dairy. She had not once thought of